Welcome, everyone, to the Nerd Journey Podcast, episode number 152. We're joining you every week to talk IT career progression and bring you the advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers. I'm your host, John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, joined by my co-host, Nick Cordy, at NetworkNerd_. Hey, Nick, how's it going?
Hey, John, I'm doing great. Happy post-holiday celebration. We are both pre-sales technical engineers with backgrounds in IT operations. We hope our career discussions will be vendor neutral, relevant across disciplines, and remain timeless. If you're enjoying our content, please drop us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with us, tweet or DM at Nerd Journey. Ultimately, we're just two nerds on a journey.
A journey to career enlightenment.
So let's take a trip.
Awesome, Nick. Hey, so today we are starting a new two-part discussion with a new interviewee, Scott Lowe.
I can't believe it's two parts.
Yeah, I know. Shocking.
That surprised me.
Shocking that it turned into two parts. Very shocked. So I am super bummed that I missed this interview. I've, of course, read Scott Lowe's blog for years, read a bunch of his books when he was writing about VMware technologies, and, that was where my wheelhouse was. He actually, I think when we were both at VMware, he briefly worked on one of my accounts when he came back.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, via the Heptio acquisition, very briefly. It was like one meeting maybe. So, again, just super bummed that I missed this recording. But, listening back to it, it went really well. I'm not sure what I could have added. It was interesting to hear about his background teaching technical material. That was a pretty interesting way into the field.
There was that, and then he talked about that path to principal engineer and what makes the elite individual contributor path the one he prefers to management.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to share with us a little bit about his blogging philosophy, about what it was like to get paid to write, and then he's going to take it one level higher, and I'm not going to tell you what that is. But here we go with part one of our interview with Scott Lowe. Scott Lowe, thanks so much for joining us on Nerd Journey today.
Hey, my pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity to jump on and chat with you. So it should be fun.
Absolutely. I'm excited about it as well. So let's start, Scott, by telling the listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do today, please, sir.
Yeah, sure. Of course. My name is Scott Lowe. I'm currently a principal field engineer at Kong. For those of you that have pets, this is not the Kong that makes those really cool toys. This is the Kong that makes an open source API gateway and an open source service mesh, and is aiming to be, sort of the I think the tagline for the company is the cloud connectivity company. So been there since mid-May.
Very cool. And can you tell me a little bit about that principal role at Kong? The principal role is kind of a distinguished one across our industry, and it normally means elite level individual contributor. How have you seen that play out, and how does that contribute to what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have been working my way up through, the ranks. When I left VMware in 2018 to join Heptio, I joined Heptio as a staff engineer, and they were very small at the time, about 50 people when I joined, and they had a roadmap, if you will, for going beyond staff, going into principal and other higher levels. But this is kind of where they were. And at that point, we started to see staff level and then moving up beyond staff level as being leaders, but not necessarily managers, right? And there's a distinction there, of course, right? When I came back into VMware through the Heptio acquisition, I went up to senior staff, and again, the emphasis was on, okay, how are you helping others in their roles, right? How are you mentoring others, whether they be junior or associate level engineers, or whether it's just, sort of the non-prefixed, field engineer or architect or whatever term we used. So And as I have now moved into Kong, we have 3 principal engineers. So I'm one of 3. And again, we have this path forward for moving ahead with things like distinguished and fellow and that sort of thing, right? But the principal engineer is really outside of a software development context. So in what we do, where we're customer facing, this context is, how are we influencing the team as a whole? Are we driving best practices? Are we driving efficiency for the company? Are we interacting with others in the industry in a way to establish ourselves as leaders within the industry, not just leaders within the company? So it's those kinds of things. And you see that sort of that trend continue as an individual contributor as you move beyond principal into distinguished or even to fellow. And these are often, especially distinguished and fellow, are considered sort of career level achievements, right? This is not, just the average Joe that, hits it and then, moves on, right? This is the culmination of a lot of work in the industry. I'm excited to pursue those. I have a lot of work ahead of me, but for me, the principal role is really about leveling up all the people around me, right? Leveling up the rest of the people on my team, sharing my knowledge, sharing anything and everything that I gain and that I learn, and making sure that they are as adequately prepared as they can be to be successful in their endeavors.
You mentioned customer facing. So I guess at some companies that can be pre-sales. At some companies it could be post-sales. Maybe it's a mix of both. In your case, which one is it?
In our case, it is mostly post-sales. You could think of it as similar to what you might refer to as a professional services organization, in that we are doing services for customers. But unlike many professional services organizations, which tend to over-rotate on the utilization number, we tend to instead focus on impact to the company as a whole, right? So it's not just about utilization. We do track that. Obviously, metrics are important for understanding what's happening within the team and across the business as a whole. But it's not like, okay, you didn't hit your, 95% utilization. So, shame on you, right? If we can show that we're making an impact in the business, whether it is involving assisting marketing with materials, or whether it is, supporting a conference event, whether it's supporting community meetups, doing write-ups for reference architectures or best practices that are shared with the rest of the team internally or even externally with customers. All of those are things that have impact.
Could some of the duties also be thought of as what we might classify as a team lead or tech lead for the team that you're on?
That's a good question. In some organizations, you might look at, staff or senior staff or principal level members of the team as a tech lead or as a practice lead. I don't think it's necessarily a given in terms of, like it has to be that way. It could be that way. It's not something that our particular team has chosen to embrace just yet. There are pros and cons for every approach in terms of how you structure things like that, whether you go with a technology based, okay, I'm a tech lead for technology X, whatever that is, right? Or whether you do something like I'm a practice lead for FinServ or, healthcare, right? There's pros and cons to each of those approaches. And it's just a matter of finding which one's the right fit at the right time during the growth stage, right? The company's in a big growth stage right now. And so we have to, the structure that we choose may have to change to accommodate that growth as we move forward.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And if you don't mind, we've interviewed a lot of people who went into management. Some wanted to pursue leadership from an early standpoint. Some never thought they would like it and they decided to try it. For you, Scott, what made that individual contributor path more attractive and has kept you in that role?
It could be a couple of different ways to describe it. I guess if one could be said it was fear of failure, right? In that I know that I can do well as an individual contributor, and I know that I have done well as an individual contributor. I've been very fortunate to have a great set of opportunities to do some amazing things over the course of my career, and I aim to continue to do amazing things as long as I'm able to do so. So part of it is I know how to be an individual contributor. I know how to be a leader while still being an individual contributor. And again, we go back to that distinction between leader and manager, right?
Oh, yeah.
I've had a lot of discussions with my wife. She is my, searching for the right term here, it's like she's my people interaction spirit animal. Maybe that's the
like
right
a
way.
Sherpa.
Yeah, right. She's my Sherpa. There you go. Right. And so I talked to her a lot about, okay, how would you approach this situation? She's a very people oriented person, super outgoing. She can strike up a conversation with anyone, and they're best friends for life. I mean, it's completely natural to her, and that doesn't necessarily happen for me. And so I rely on her insight a lot. And I say, oh, how would you approach this situation? How would you approach that situation? So on and so forth. So I think that I probably, over the years, having gleaned a lot of useful information from her and in emulating her and her ability to interact with folks, I probably could be a successful people manager, especially with my focus on helping others be successful. Because I believe a manager to be someone whose primary role is to clear the way for your team members to do amazing things, right? Just get the roadblocks out of the way. Whatever those roadblocks are, just get them out of the way. Make sure they have the resources they need, the time they need, the runway they need to do whatever it is they have, they are gifted to do. So I think I could be a successful manager, but I have shied away from it primarily because I find the greatest job satisfaction and the greatest fulfillment in being very close to the technology. And I feel like if I got too far away from the tech, I would lose my passion. I would lose my zeal to get up and try and figure out what is it that makes this thing work, and how can I unpack it, and then how can I explain it to somebody else so they understand it and they could use that in what they're trying to do as well.
I like that. And I wanted to ask those questions at the beginning so we could frame the whole discussion and come full circle at the end. So you mentioned you like to explain things to people and help them understand it. This actually started with early experience as a technical trainer. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. That's going way back in the career annals there. Yeah, so I basically started my career by and large. I had a few jobs here and there before I really got into tech, but I was always technically oriented in whatever job I was doing. And computers have been a passion and a hobby as much as a career for me. If we have time, I'll tell you the story of how I managed to land my first computer. But the role of being a trainer, a technical trainer, I would say a trainer first. I got a job with a company who was training pharmaceutical sales reps in the mid 90s. And these pharmaceutical sales reps would carry around laptops, and they would have these weird pieces of software that they would have to dial up and synchronize all these databases every day, right? And the databases were things of keeping track of like the samples that they were leaving, the doctors that they saw, this kind of stuff, right? And this is before the sort of the widespread internet connectivity. I mean, like it was a little more challenging, right? You was still dial up and the whole thing. And this particular company that I was working for was very, very particular about two things. One, about your skills as an instructor. So anytime we weren't actually speaking or training in front of customers, we were training to be training, right? And the other thing they were particular about is making sure that the instructors, when we went in to talk to a customer, that we spoke the customer's language. So we would do what we called ride-alongs with the customer. We would be jotting down all the lingo and all of the jargon that they used. And so then the instructors would come in and they would say these things, and the sales reps would be like, you're using like our language. How did you do that? How did you know to describe it that way? Because that's exactly the way we describe it. And that was a lot of fun. And I did that. And so I was like this, traveling through airports, carrying 3 or 4 giant laptops, which were not fun to carry at that time.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, the big heavy ones. But, going around training all these people from all these different pharmaceutical companies. But then it was right around the time that, so this was 1995, Windows 95 was coming out, and they wanted to train the instructors on Windows 95 because, of course, this was a big technology change. And so I volunteered. I stepped up and said, hey, I'll do it. And so I started digging into a bunch of the tech and, getting deeper than, your usual sort of, click here. But how did it work? What was different under the covers from what they already knew? So on and so forth. And I found that the technical side of that, like the teaching more so than the instructing, right? And again, those subtle differences was really like, I super enjoyed that, enjoyed it immensely. And so I left that company to go to work for a company that was a Microsoft official curriculum, kind of whatever. I don't even remember the terms that they use these days. But I became a Microsoft certified trainer, and I began delivering official Microsoft courses, technical courses where people were seeking to get their MCSE or their Microsoft Certified Professional MCP at the time, right? So things like Windows NT and TCP/IP and blah blah blah. And I did that for a number of years. And the company that I was working for had this unusual relationship with a what we call a VAR, value added reseller, right? And the instructors would go do consulting work for the VAR when they had time, and the consultants at the VAR would come teach classes when they had time. And so it was like this crossover thing. And it was getting into that I started doing more of the consulting work that then has since been a large part of my career. But yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the technical training part, because when I was interviewing with Craig McCluskey for the Heptio position, he asked me, he's like, is there a theme to your career? And I'd never really thought about it. And I said, I guess if I had to pick one, it would be education. It would be teaching people, because even if first I was a trainer and then a technical trainer, then even as I was a consultant, there's always that process when you wrap up the project or when you're getting ready to wrap up the project and you're telling the customer, okay, this is what we've done. This is how you're going to manage what we installed for you, or this is how you're going to interact with it, or this is how you're going to support it. These are the things you need to know, writing up whatever it was, that kind of thing. So even in that there's education. And then as I began to blog and write books and that sort of thing, again, there's that aspect of education, of sharing knowledge and making sure other people are equipped to, do amazing things.
Now, in doing that, did you ever at any point want to be a classroom teacher for high school, college, anything like that? Or did you prefer being in the technical sphere with the technology?
Very much in the technical sphere. My wife was a teacher before she became a real estate agent. Let's just say that, a real estate agent pays a lot better than teacher.
For sure.
And the hours, even though it's, nights and weekends showing houses to people, is still way better than the insane amount of hours she spent as a teacher. So I have great respect for teachers, but I never had any desire to go into the classroom other than the technical classroom and talk about, subnet masks, right? And why they only make sense if you think about them in binary.
Well, there you go. Did they give you a set curriculum to teach, a certain way to do it, or did you get to paint your own canvas and use your own style throughout? How did that go?
Yeah, for the Microsoft stuff, the curriculum was very, very well defined. You got a giant binder from Microsoft, and you had to attend the course by somebody who had already been approved to teach it first. And then after you had attended the course, then you were authorized to teach the course. And so you went through their very prescriptive curriculum and taught it the way they wanted. But you would always find that there were certain things that worked better than others. So you might say, okay, we're getting ready to talk about this thing, but we need to go talk about this other thing over here first. So let's go over and talk about this other thing over here first, even though it's later in the curriculum. We're just going to cover this real quick, and then we'll come back, and then we'll talk about this thing because it'll make more sense to you, right? And so you did do some of that. Probably weren't supposed to, but as long as the students were giving you positive reviews and saying that, yeah, that he or she was an effective instructor and I learned a lot, then it didn't really matter.
It seems to me that some of the best instructors have learned how they learn really well and how to learn very well themselves. And then they figure out, okay, how can I best teach it to this other person that's in my classroom, so to speak?
I think it is important, if you are trying to teach someone else something, to understand the way that you learn, but also understand that there are different styles and modes of learning. Recognize your own flaws. So back in that time, we had this phrase for somebody who liked to go off and explore, and we would call them a Lewis and Clarker, right? That they would just go off and they would explore. And so you'd be up in front of the room and you'd be talking about some piece of technology or some aspect of the product that you were teaching, and you'd be drawing or, going through a slide or whatever the case may be. And you can tell that they're not paying attention because they're looking at the computer in front of them and they're clicking and typing and like we're not supposed to be doing anything. We're not doing a lab right now. You should be watching me, not going off. And so they'd be off exploring. And, sometimes it helps. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it's not. sometimes they'll end up asking you the very thing you just explained, right? Can you tell me about blah? And like, well, you can have some fun with it if you have a good rapport with the students. Well, if you've been paying attention, you would know that blah, 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 right? But I bring that up just to say that I recognize in my own style that that's the way that I learn, is I have to go off and explore and find things. And so as I taught others and recognized that tendency in others, I was able to tailor my teaching style to address that. To say, now look, pay attention. If you're off exploring right now, pay attention. This concept is going to be important later, and it'll unlock other things that you're going to need in your exploration, right? It's sort of like a prerequisite, if you will. So there is that, but I do think it's important. And again, going back to how much I have learned from my wife as a teacher, she, of course, learned the science of education, right? In terms of how you go about teaching a concept, how you go about understanding a student's way of learning, how to address that, how to build in multimodal sort of lessons that address, those who see visually and learn, those who hear it and learn, those who do it and learn, building all of these concepts together into a single thing. I picked up a lot from her as well. And I think that has also informed my style of conveying education. I won't call it teaching because I don't really do it in the classroom anymore, but my style of conveying education to others. So.
Sure. And I think what listeners should take away from this is there's an element of educational opportunity in everything you're doing with the people you work with, no matter who they are. There's something you can learn from them, and there's something that you can probably teach them if only you take the time, very much like Scott mentioned, to figure out how are they going to learn it best? How can I present this in a way that will help others understand? It may not be the same way that I have to consume information, but I think it's important that we teach the other people we work with, and that we learn from the other people we work with, because it makes everybody on the team better.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Nick. And tying this back to our earlier discussion about, being a senior level member of a team, and reemphasizing again that process of sharing the expertise that you have built over the course of your career that has earned you, a staff or a principal level designation is part of the expectation for being in that senior level role, is that you are in many ways expected to share that knowledge. And so making sure that you get in the habit of teaching others on the team and taking, I'm not saying you have to take everything and turn it into a teachable moment, right? But being aware that there are plenty of opportunities in almost every situation. There are plenty of opportunities where you can share knowledge that will empower those on your team. And the more that you empower folks on your team, the more you will be seen and recognized as a leader on that team, I believe.
You're sort of like the person who just bought a container of silly putty from Lowe's or Home Depot, and you're looking for the holes in the wall, and you go, okay, I can fill that hole. I can fill that hole. You spot the gaps, and you try and fill them for the team and those around you, is what it means to me, at least.
Yeah, the analogy of silly putty and filling the gaps is a great analogy. I think that's a very apt one.
Does it seem to you, Scott, that some folks in our industry are maybe afraid to do that because they don't want other people to get ahead of them in the promotion cycle, or maybe they don't work at a company big enough to have the roles that let you progress as the individual contributor?
I think that is a fair assessment. I believe that probably a lot of folks do think that the more they hold on to the knowledge that they have, the more valuable they will become to the company, and therefore are less likely to be, eliminated in a reduction in force or whatever the case may be, right? At the same time, I believe the more that you hold on to that information, the more that you tie yourself to whatever it is that you're doing right at that moment, rather than enabling others to do what you're doing and then potentially freeing you up to go on and do other things, right? There's a saying, and I don't know who to attribute the saying to, but the saying is that the best way to get promoted is to make yourself replaceable. Because if somebody else can step in and take your role, if you have empowered other people to step in and take your role, then you can be freed up to say, I want to go on and tackle something else. I want to tackle something larger, more strategic, something different, something new, whatever it is that your employer wants, or what you want out of your career.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it probably gives us a little bit of fear, the something new. There's the thing and the thing you think you might want to do, but you don't know everything about, and a little bit of loss aversion plagues us.
Absolutely. Cue the discussion about people manager versus individual contributor.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you enjoyed this education and sharing knowledge with others so much, is that how you got into blogging?
Indirectly, I would say yes. I think it is why I got into blogging, even if I didn't recognize that that's why I got into blogging when I first did it. I first started writing on my site in 2005. Actually, for several months, it was an internal site. Like I was running my own consultancy at the time, and I had my own infrastructure on premises in my house, and I was using virtualization, of course, on a pair of like reused Compaq servers to show you how old they are, right? It was still branded Compaq at the time. And I had an internal system that I was running WordPress on, and then I was doing internal blogging on, right? And it started out, or at least I was telling myself it started out as a way for me to write down things that I had figured out so that in case I needed to find them later, I could come back to it and find it later, right?
Absolutely.
And that's fine. And it still serves that purpose. I still find myself going back to my own site now, 16 years later, and thinking, how was it I did that thing again? Oh yeah, I wrote about this. Hold on. Let me look that up real quick, right? So it still does serve that purpose. But in looking back on it now, I think what drove me to make the site public was the fact that I wanted to share that information with others as well, not just for myself. Yes, it serves a purpose for me in helping me remember things that I figured out, or even over time, I had to find the right way to describe it. Over time, knowledge, it compacts down and it becomes like this bedrock. And it's that foundation of knowledge that has become compacted over time with other things coming in on it and other things coming on it that allows you to sort of reach these new levels of expertise in a particular area, right? You have to build that foundation first. And so it serves a very valuable purpose in helping to create that bedrock, that foundation, by taking that knowledge and then laying it on another layer of what I've already learned. But it also is serving that purpose of making that information available to others. And I can't tell you, Nick, how many times I've gotten an email from somebody who they said, I was stuck. I had no idea what I was going to do. I was up all night. And then at 3 a.m., I found your blog post and it solved my problem. And it's that kind of email that just gives you goosebumps, and you're like, that made it all worthwhile, as I helped, her or him solve their problem in a time of need. That's awesome.
And that's very similar to the student who says, Scott, your explanation of subnet masks through binary was the only way I've ever understood it from anyone I've ever heard it from, and I really appreciate it. Very similar to the feedback from people in, quote, the technical classroom.
That is true. I have not made that connection until now, but you're absolutely right.
That's what I equated to. So, yeah, that's great. Now, how often did you blog in the beginning, and what kind of cadence do you keep to now? So, some people go nuts with it. Some people, it's once a month, once a week. What's your cadence?
Yeah, that's a good question. Early on, I was a blogging machine. I would do 8, 10, 12 posts in a month. It was not uncommon. Now, this was at the early days of VMware taking off, right? So this was VI3 days and then moving into vSphere 4. So 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, that kind of thing. And there was just so much to write about. There were a lot of other bloggers, a lot of the people who are very, very well known in VMware centric communities. You got their start in those early times as well. People like Duncan Epping and Frank Denneman, who are now, just, I don't even know how to describe them, rock stars, if you will. I know some people have an aversion to that term, so sorry, but extremely well known individuals who have been very, very successful. And there was just so much to write about.
Cut their teeth. Let's just say it that way.
Oh yeah, absolutely, for sure, absolutely. And there was just so much to write about that you could easily publish every day if you wanted to, if you had the time. So I wrote a lot, but over the years it slowed down, and Now I'll do anywhere between 4 and 6 a month, something like that. Just depends. I think August was a slow month for me, and maybe September was a slow month, but October is shaping up to be pretty good so far. So I think I'm at 4 or 5 for October. So it's hard to say. I know some folks will say that, oh, you have to have a cadence. You have to publish, at the same time, on the same day, every week, so that people know to find your content. They know to go look for it, and that kind of thing. And I've also had people say, oh, you need to be more laser focused. You need to talk about just one thing. Like, you need to focus on this one subject area or this one subject matter. And honestly, I don't know if it's just longevity or if it's something else, but I get plenty of traffic. I don't try to monetize it, but I get plenty of traffic. I get plenty of visibility. I got great page rank, and I don't do any of that stuff. So if you're out there thinking about blogging, like, don't get so hung up on the, oh, you have to do it this way. Just go ahead and do it. If you enjoy it, just go ahead and do it. And all the rest of it, it'll all work itself out.
I feel like if you start writing and you enjoy it, you'll never run out of ideas. Like, you're going to keep getting ideas as you continue to write. That's my thinking. I like your advice for people who maybe have thought about it but haven't started blogging. What if I'm someone who doesn't feel like I'm a great writer, but I'd like to do something like that to stand out?
That's a question that's been asked and discussed a lot over the years. And I am of the camp that if you are blogging because you want to get more visibility because it's going to lead to a better job, I'm not convinced that's the right reason to do it. And that's a bit controversial with some folks, right?
Sure.
Again, there are those people who will say that, oh, you should go blog and you should do it, and you should do it this way, of course, right? Follow all the SEO rules and publish every day at this time and da-da-da-da-da. And, before you know it, you'll have 10,000 followers or whatever, the thing is, right?
And don't forget clickbait article titles.
Yes.
5 things you must do every day on LinkedIn.
Right. Yes. Top 6 things you should do to your blog.
That's Scott's next title, by the way.
Right. I might. But I think I take a bit of a contrarian position here than some folks in the industry, because I believe that you should write or blog because the act of creating content, whether it is video content, whether it is audio content, like what we're doing right here on the podcast, whether it's written form content, whether it is an example, a set of sample code files that you publish in a repository on GitHub, right? All of these forms of content become mechanisms and vehicles for conveying information to others to enable and empower them. And if your goal is to enable and empower others, then absolutely you should get in and you should do it, especially if you enjoy it. If you don't enjoy it, stick with it for a little while. But I don't believe, and again, this is just my personal take on it, I don't believe you should get into this strictly for financial reasons. Because I think what's going to happen is you're going to end up burning out, and your blog will end up being, or your YouTube channel or whatever the case is, will end up being a flash in the pan rather than something that has staying power because it's coming from a place of deep conviction and deep commitment within your character, saying, I have a desire to share this information with others because I believe it will be useful. Or in some cases, people have a desire to share this content because they believe it will be entertaining. And that's fine too. I'm not a I'm not a TikTok person, right? But that's okay. Lots of people are, and that's fine. No judgment here, right? But I think that whatever sort of content you are creating, whether you are somebody who's live streaming or whatever the case may be, you should do it because it comes from a desire, a passion inside yourself, not because, hey, I want to get to 100,000 followers because then I want to get free stuff because they'll send it to me for me to review it and da-da-da. I mean, to me, that's just the wrong motivation. And I've said as much in the past, when the topic comes up and people ask, hey, I'm going to start a blog because, my buddy over here started a blog and he got promoted. And so I want to get promoted too. And yeah, I don't know how well it's going to work out for you.
It actually sounds to me like you're saying you need to come at it with the same heart of someone who is seeking to do that principal level work, who wants to contribute the knowledge and share it with others to build them up too, if we make that connection.
That's a fair connection. It is true that as, a senior level team member, again, we talked about this earlier, how you are expected to mentor and you are expected to guide and lead, junior members of the team. And all of those things, all of those skills are things that you will develop if you are sharing content for the purposes of empowering and enabling others.
I have not heard someone take that stance, Scott, about blogging. That's a very interesting point. I appreciate you sharing that on the show. Now, speaking of the getting incentivized or wanting to get to a certain number of likes or getting paid, you were actually paid to write some articles for Tech Target, I think, for a little while. When you get paid to do something you enjoy for no pay, how does that affect the motivation and the level of output for the work itself?
I think the big challenge for me at that time, and it wasn't long, it was only a couple of years, I think, that I was creating some articles for Tech Target. And that was when Scott D. Lowe and I kept running into each other because he was also writing for Tech Republic and I was writing for Tech Target. And that just made things even worse than the fact that there were two people named Scott Lowe in the technology industry, which totally blew people's minds. In any case, the biggest thing that I struggled with during that time period was just knowing that I had to write something. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit, but for me, blogging it's a passion. It's me getting to share the enjoyment that I get out of figuring something out, unraveling the challenge, solving the problem, finding a new way of doing something, applying a new technology to an old problem, combining technologies, whatever the case may be. It's a way for me to share that. And I believe, and it has proven true, that this information ends up being useful to other folks, that they end up finding value in it in a variety of ways, often in ways that I don't anticipate. But when you're writing for pay, it's like, okay, you need to write something. And you're like, well, I'm not inspired to write anything. It doesn't matter. You have to write something. Like, you have a deadline next week and they want an article and you have to write it. And that's just how it is, right? And that was the thing that I personally found the most challenging out of that process. Once, if I had an idea of something that I wanted to talk about, then the fact that I was writing it for pay was irrelevant. I had an idea. I had something I could talk about. I had a soapbox that I could stand on, a position I could rant about, whatever the case may be. I could then go and just run with it. But if I'm sitting there 2 days before my deadline, I'm like, I got nothing, right? At least nothing that would be suitable there. I mean, like, the kind of stuff that I write on my site where I'm taking step 1, type in this command, step 2, type in that command, doesn't necessarily translate as well to those types of sites, right?
Certainly.
So, that was it for me. But I enjoyed the opportunity to do it. I'm glad that I did it. It was just that process of sort of, it almost with the writing almost becomes like the job, right? And then you're like, oh, I gotta write another article, and you're not inspired or motivated to do so because it's not coming from that place of commitment and passion within you. It's like, oh, I just have to do this thing.
Right. Well, at least you got to pick the topic, it sounds like. And they didn't say, hey, Scott, we need an article on storage or something like that.
Sometimes they would tell me what they wanted me to write about occasionally. Fortunately, again, if I had stayed in it longer, I'm sure I would have run into more situations where I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to write about that. I'm just not, right? You want me to write about, whatever, Windows over here or something like that, right? I'm like, sorry, I'm not going to do it. But I didn't run into that problem. The editors that I worked with were outstanding individuals. All of them. I have no complaints at all about any of the editors that I worked with or any of the organizations that I worked with. So I very lucky in that regard.
We've talked to a couple folks on the show that their hobby became their job, and they had to sort of find some other creative outlet to keep the passion, excitement going in their life so that it wasn't, as you said, oh man, I have to write another article. I guess I'll go do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I can't stress just how fortunate I've been to have great managers who recognize that for me, I can add value in ways that may not seem at first glance. Like if I'm off messing around with this thing over here, at first glance, you may look at that and say, well, what is what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this? But then after I mess with that thing a little bit, and then I come back with some insight that I can share with the rest of the team, and everybody's like, oh, we can do that with this or this or this. And then suddenly the light bulb goes off and they're like, okay, all right, I see how this works, So I've been, again, very fortunate to have a set of managers over the course of my career that recognized that and gave me the ability to do that. But that's part, like I'm able to channel my creative juices that way so that it doesn't become the job, right? And I can still learn new things in the roles that I'm in and still share information with folks and still, get revitalized when I hit that new technology and be like, okay, I got to figure out how this works.
And I think what you're speaking to at a greater level here, Scott, is the intent with which you do the things. Because, as you said earlier, I'm not doing this to beat my chest necessarily and say, hey, I'm great. It's more of a place of humility. I think this will help someone. That's a large part of the reason I'm doing it. There is, of course, a side benefit to me as well, as a gaining experience, gaining knowledge.
Oh, yeah. And I know it sounds self-serving to say that, you're not trying to be like all that.
Right.
But truly and honestly, like I share this because I do believe that it will help somebody. And sometimes it's years later. Like in 2011, 2012, I started working with this technology called Open vSwitch, OVS, right? And at the time it was only being used in a couple of relatively not super well-known projects or things, but I started digging into it and sharing this information. And I even 5 years later, somebody writes me and says, man, this stuff that you wrote on Open vSwitch was super useful. I really, really found it helpful when I was trying to figure out this problem that I was doing with whatever, technology it was that had, started using Open vSwitch inside it. So sometimes the payoff is like really delayed, but it's still there. And I've seen it even going back farther than that, like 2007, 2008. I don't know why, but I got on a kick of integrating Unix and Linux systems with Active Directory, right? Actually, I do know why. It was because I was working with a customer to do that for them, and that just kind of spun me off in a tailspin. And so I ended up writing, I don't know, half a dozen different articles on how to integrate, Linux with Active Directory, how to integrate Solaris with Active Directory, how to integrate OpenBSD with Active Directory, all these things and I mean, a decade later, somebody says, hey, are you going to update your Solaris article? And I'm like, no, Sun doesn't even exist anymore. That company is gone. They got bought by Oracle. It's like long gone. No, I'm not going to update it. Oh man. So the payoff happens. And
you just don't know when.
You just don't know when. Right. Yeah. But You're right. Getting back to your earlier point, it is about the intent with which you do it. And that comes back to that statement I made about why you blog or why you create content, right? It's about the intent. Are you doing it because you want to get a promotion? I don't know if that's going to work out, right? Maybe it will. And maybe that's fine for you. For me, I believe it has to come from a place of, I want to genuinely improve the experience, the whatever for others, right? I want to make, I'm building a path, paving a road to make it easier for those to follow.
I like that. That's great. Now, at what point did you transition from writing blogs to writing books? Because that's a little bit of a jump, right? Well, maybe not if you're blogging 12 times a month.
It's still a jump. So yeah, there's a great backstory there that I'll be happy to share with you if you're interested. But the first book happened in 2009, I believe. And it was just happenstance. A colleague of mine, a very good friend, I would say, he got offered to write a book. He couldn't. He asked me, do you want to do it? And I was like, sure. And before you know it, there's Mastering VMware vSphere 4, which was by all accounts, a runaway success. And then we went on to do Mastering vSphere 5 and
got a copy of that one.
Yeah, right.
I remember reading it.
A whole bevy of other things. I was fortunate enough to work with Forbes Guthrie and Maish Seidel-Keesing on VMware vSphere Design. That's another one that I had somebody ask me, hey, you're going to do a third edition? I'm like, no, probably not. It is a very different thing than writing blog posts, a very different thing. And it was very, very intensive. One of the things that I did just as we're all more than just our job, right? We are,
Of course.
we are fathers or brothers or sons or, daughters and sisters and wives and, we're all these other things, right? We are friends. We are, whatever. And one of the things that I did when I got the opportunity to write the book, I knew the timeline was very aggressive. And I sat down with my family and I was like, look, this opportunity has been presented for me to write this book. And it's going to mean that I'm going to be, working a lot in the nights and the evenings. Right. And I had young kids at the time when this happened. They're all grown and moved out now, but they were younger then and they were still at home. And I felt like it was important to make sure that that everybody in the family bought off on this and said, yeah, we understand what this means. We know what this means for you as our dad, that you're going to be sitting at the computer a lot, more so than you already do. Right. Because I'm going to be like pounding out these words. And that means they need to step up and they need to help out around the house and they need to help my wife, their mom, take care of things because I'm not going to be able to do as much. And, everybody was super supportive, which I'm very thankful for, which is really the only reason why my wife and I decided that I should go ahead and do that. But it's a ton of work. I'm not going to mince words. It's a ton of work to write a book and very different than writing a blog post or, producing a video or anything like that. So.
And what makes you want to say yes when someone says, hey, Scott, you want to write this book? Yeah. Like what inside produces the, yes, that is what I want to do?
Well, for me, I had wanted to write a book for years and years.
Okay.
I mean, I don't even know why. I'm an avid reader. I love to read. Most of what I read is fiction. I do read some business stuff. I don't read a lot of technology books, even though that's what I write, which is kind of ironic. But that's just not me. Right. And so I'd wanted to write a book. There's just something about saying I wanted to write a book, that I was a published author, that I wanted that. And I had worked and tried to make it happen, and it didn't happen. And, it's kind of funny because I finally stepped back and said, okay, I'm going to stop like chasing this thing. And when the time is right, it'll happen. And it was about 6 months later that it happened. It's
wow.
really kind of weird, right? You could, depending on what you believe or how you feel, you could ascribe that to various different things, but it just happened that I finally stopped chasing it. And then about 6 months later, it just fell in my lap. And I was like, yeah, of course I'm going to. Like I've wanted this for years. Of course I will. So, and it was a long haul. I mean, we got the book written in just over 4 months, 4.5, 5 months. It was late January. And then we published in June we didn't publish in June. We finished writing and editing in June, and then it went to production. And then the first copies rolled out at VMworld 2009 in San Francisco. So, and that was
nice.
August. Yeah.
And that's another example of widening that impact and content creation for the broader community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of prestige there being a published author of a book. That's a big deal. And a lot of people, it seems like some of the more successful folks in the tech industry have done that. Not all of them, right? But several folks that I've heard of have pursued writing a book.
I think as a writer, and I call myself a writer because of, having spent so many years writing stuff on the site, I believe that writing is powerful in many, many ways. I think that it's so crucial to what we do. We are often referred to as information workers or knowledge workers, right?
Yes, sir.
And how do we convey that knowledge? Sometimes we convey that knowledge in video content. Sometimes we can convey it in audio content, but so much of our everything about humanity is in written form. I mean, it is so incredibly central to all that we are as a people that spending the time to do that and make yourself better at it pays off in so many other ways. Right. You can write a more effective memo to your boss explaining why it is that you need to do this upgrade that you're proposing. Right. You can more effectively structure that content and lay out your argument because you've practiced writing. You can understand, seeing someone else's arguments, maybe where there are flaws in those arguments and saying, well, okay, I see your point here, but the reality is that it's this over here. And, so I'm not going to buy this product from you, Mr. Vendor, right? Because you're working from a flawed position of a flawed assumption. But all of that comes out of understanding our language and using our language and putting our language to work for you, whatever that language is. You and I obviously conversing English, but the same applies to people writing in other languages, whether you're writing in, French or German or whatever, Swahili, right? Becoming familiar with and fluent with that tool just gives you power to be more effective as an individual, as a communicator, and as a leader. And again, I think all of these things are so intermeshed in that career ladder of being able to make yourself more effective at broadening your sphere of influence. And as your sphere of influence broadens, then the company recognizes, hey, this lady here, she's doing great work. We need to promote her, right? We need to make her a leader, not a manager necessarily, although that's fine too, but a leader within our team. But all that being said, I think writing is useful for all folks, but be careful stepping in to write a book. Like it's a whole nother creature, right? I will share one relatively amusing anecdote, and then we can move on. And that is, somebody might say, well, Scott, okay, so you're telling us to be careful writing a book, but you've written 8 of them. So what is going on here? Right? Like, and I'm going to use this analogy, and I'm going to give the credit for the story was 2 people that I was talking to. They're now analysts at various firms, right? And we were at a conference, and I was talking to this gentleman, and we're walking through the show hall at the conference. It was actually a VM World. We're walking through the show hall, right? And we're talking, blah, blah, whatever. And we come upon this lady who had written a book, and she was really, really well known. And we all just started talking, so on and so forth. And the gentleman asked, he's like, well, are you writing another book? And she's like, yes. And he says, well, why are you doing that? You've talked so much about a book being so hard. Why are you doing that? And she said, now, so, I'm not borrowing this analogy because I don't have any direct experience in this, but this is what she said. She said, it's like giving birth to a baby. It's really, really hard, and it's really, really painful. But after it's done and you look back on it, you don't remember that. And so then somebody says, you want to do it again? And you're like, sure. And then you get into it, and then you realize you're like, this is why I didn't want to do it again. But then after you go through all that and it's done, then you forget about it again. Right. And again, I obviously have not given birth to a child, so right. I'm not speaking for personal experience, but she had, and she used that analogy. So that's why I say, it's hard. It's a lot of work. After you do it, you'll look back on it. And as humans, we have a tendency of doing this. We'll look back on it and we'll sort of paint it with rose-colored, glasses, right? And that wasn't so bad. I did staying up till 3 a.m. writing. That wasn't so bad. That kind of thing.
It's the growth that brings the joy, right?
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. So I imagine that there is a ton when you agree to write a book, because, you agreeing to write a book on mastering vSphere, it doesn't mean you know every setting in vSphere when you started, right? You got to figure some of that stuff out as you go.
Yes, absolutely. And just like writing a blog post or teaching something, I use blog posts because that's what I do a lot, but teaching something to someone else, right? Whatever form that looks like, sharing that content, it solidifies your own understanding of the topic. Because you're going to go in and be like, well, wait a minute, how do I understand this? How do I explain this? And if you find that you're having a hard time explaining it, it's probably because you don't understand it well enough, right? So you're absolutely right. I take on this task of writing this book about mastering vSphere. I'm familiar with vSphere. I know it well. But at the time, we were writing against beta code because the product hadn't even been released yet, right? So we were doing screenshots against beta code. We were writing against beta code. And then when a new build was released, we had to go back and edit the content again because names might have changed, screens might have changed, features might have been renamed, whatever the case may be. But you're right.
Buttons move.
Yes, buttons move, right? Exactly. Dialog boxes get redone. Exactly. But there's so much learning that happens in that process because you are forced to embrace all of the different aspects of whatever it is you're writing about. And you have to poke into every little corner, every little niche and say, what does this do? And why does it do that? And how do I configure it? And what does it play with? So yeah, there's a lot of learning that happens. And I would say that the process of writing Mastering vSphere 4 and then again with 5, I learned tons, even though I had been working with the VMware hypervisor for years.
Yeah, and that was one of those books, like, you need to get this to study for a VMware certified professional, take the class, and you'll pass. And it worked.
Yeah, even though it was never intended as a certification guide. Like we never wrote it that way. But I heard you are not the first person I've heard say that, the book was incredibly helpful in passing the certification.
Oh yeah, superbly helpful, superbly.
And let's break there for part one. Nick, I too read Mastering vSphere as part of my certification journey for VMware. So
it's a great book.
Yeah. And a lot of it is evergreen too. Some of the technology changes, but the underlying stuff, that you get a lot of it. I guess that's all part of the mastery of the underlying subject and not just the UI elements, right?
For sure.
I also really found it interesting that Scott was talking about impact as someone who helps others to develop, but also wanting to stay close to technology as an individual contributor versus managing people. That was pretty fascinating. And then teaching and blogging / writing, those struck me as two facets of the same process, right? Kind of the helping other people develop. And even that kind of fed into like the next thing that I noticed, which was, the reasons to blog. I think you asked about that, and write in general, right? I think, we're jumping ahead in time. It kind of complements the approach that we're going to hear from the return interview with Josh Duffney. I just want to tease that. It's not the next episode and it's not even the next interview, but we have it in the can, and it just really reminded me of what Josh said, like, that writing process as a process that helps you to fully understand a topic, and I think we said before, like, it's just another aspect of teaching. You teach a topic and then you find out like how much you really know about that topic.
Well, Don Jones said that teaching is just repackaging information. Yeah. And this also reminds me of what Chris Wall said about writing being one of the most valuable skills that you can hone as a technologist. It's just aligning with so many different people's advice. And I will say the impact of helping other people develop, in my mind, he took a humble approach to sharing. It's not really a, hey, look at me. It's more of a, I figured this out, and I think it would be helpful for other people to understand it too. And the way I can provide value to them is by sharing what I learned. That's how I see his approach, and I really like that.
Yeah, I like that too. And I would say to the listeners, like, it doesn't matter like what level you're at. Like, it's starting at anything. Like, even like that point that you're trying to explain to your future self. Like, I figured this thing out. I want to explain it to somebody, and that somebody just might be myself, 6 months from now when I've forgotten this topic. Another thing that I found interesting was his view of that principal title. He's been in several different organizations, VMware at 2 different times, 2 different times where the philosophy might have actually changed. So it's interesting to hear about his take on that title, and the path and track towards it, through it even, in different organizations, and how it needs to, match the growth point of the organization and what it means and what that person does. Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting when he talked about why he likes the individual contributor path the best. It seemed like he didn't completely rule out management as an option in the future. Kind of a, I think I probably could do it. It's not really a focus for me right now. But I didn't hear him rule it out completely.
Definitely not.
And that seems to jive with other people at the principal role that I've talked to, aside from the show. They may not want to be a people leader, but it doesn't mean that they have completely said, forget it, I'm never going to do that.
Right. Well, I guess when you're aligned with people at that level, director plus, and you are talking to them and seeing what they do day to day, that kind of seeps into maybe what it is that you do. That's a little bit speculative. Maybe I could have added something to the conversation in retrospect.
I'm sure you could have. Absolutely. Power outages are a bummer, man.
We'll bring that up to the next person that has a high level, staff engineer plus title and see what they have to say about that.
Yeah. How about those ride-alongs that he did as a technical trainer with the customers that company was serving? I love the fact that they learned the business lingo and jargon of the company so that they could better communicate with the people they were training.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Extra time and effort, but nice touch, and I think more impactful.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking to the people in a way that they can understand, which just makes sense.
Yep.
Well, anything else before we get out of here?
If we tease part 2 a little bit, we'll see a little bit more about what Scott's up to now and how he has maybe had to change the way he manages his time in doing all these highly impactful things, and maybe how you should too if that's the direction you're headed.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear more about Kong.
Just a reminder, we want people to subscribe and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Don't forget to rate the show. We want to know if we're being helpful and are always looking for interesting questions to ponder. We're collectively on Twitter @NerdJourney.
All right, farewell listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White @VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy @NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.